All right, guys, welcome into my official college football 2024 12-team playoff predictions. This is something new. We're not used to the 12-team playoff, so I'm going to go through all the 12 teams that I think are going to be making it. Some of these predictions a little bit bolder than others, of course. I'm sure we're going to have the same 4 or 5 teams, and then after that, it's kind of who you want. But beginning with the number 12 seed, we could all assume it will be the Group of 5 auto bid. And when it comes to the number 12 seed, I do have the Memphis Tigers making the playoff for a number of different reasons. Now, with the group of 5, I did debate with myself. You've got Boise State. They did make an interesting decision with not starting Malachi Nelson, but they were really good towards the end of last year. You have some other teams like UTSA, who I believe right now is ranked higher in terms of FPI than Memphis, but I do like Memphis returning QB. They've got continuity. They always seem to be at least a solid team, and this year they do have a relatively easy schedule. You look at all the FBS, their schedule is ranked 99th, and I think based off of returning QB, returning production, Memphis possibly only loses one game out of the American, and they end up making it. You do also have Liberty, which is another interesting situation. Liberty with a ridiculously easy schedule. I do wonder if they go 13-0 and maybe Memphis goes 12-1 if they would take Memphis just because of how easy Liberty's schedule is. But there's going to be a lot of other teams also potentially in play. I've heard about South Florida. They're getting some hype. They could potentially have a chance, but I will be going with Memphis. I did these predictions like 5 or 6 months ago, and I did have Memphis making it, and I'm sticking to it when it comes to that. Moving on to the number 11 seed, we are going to be going with Tennessee. So this one may be a little bit more bold, but with Tennessee, I could see, as a number 11 seed, that gives them 3 losses, and you're not even going to be in the SEC championship. So you go 9-3 in the SEC with some big wins. They do face both Georgia and Alabama. I believe they're at Georgia versus Alabama. They've got a huge game early in the season, neutral site affair against NC State. That's going to be very key for Tennessee. When you're talking about those SEC teams, when you're talking about the Big Ten teams with potentially 3 losses, jockeying for a playoff position, if they're able to beat NC State, which they should, NC State's a solid team, but they're more talented. Tennessee, we know how good their offense is. Normally, I have a higher propensity to go and kind of be favorable to a team with a really explosive offense and the young quarterback Nico Lamaliva. But Tennessee, if they get that early season win against NC State, and then if you're a Tennessee fan, root for NC State to win out or at least do as well as they could. Maybe they'll be like a top 15, top 20 team, and you've got that extra key win, that key non-conference win boost over some of the other teams, maybe the 3 lost teams in the Big Ten and in the SEC, and that could help them make the playoff. I do not have Ole Miss making it. I have Tennessee over Ole Miss. I know that's an unpopular opinion, but I do like Tennessee's explosive offense. I do like their young superstar QB. This is a lot of projection, but I am going to be going with Tennessee. It's a manageable schedule outside of the 2 really tough games. If they're able to split with Alabama and Georgia, maybe they beat Bama at home. I mean, they could even lose to both of these teams and lose to someone else and still make it if they're able to beat NC State early in the season and NC State ends up being a quality win for them. So I like the way their non-conference schedule sets up. I like the explosiveness, the big plays on offense, makes it easier to win big games, and I do have Tennessee being the number 11 overall seed. Moving on to the number 10 seed, we are going to be going with maybe a little bit of a surprise here as well. We're going to go with Utah. Now, basically every prediction that I've seen when it comes to Utah, they're the number 4 seed, right? Because they win the Big 12, they get the auto bid. But I have 2 Big 12 teams making it. I do have Utah making it. Winning on the road in Utah for any of these Big 12 teams is going to be not impossible, but it's going to be extremely hard. Now, Utah doesn't have great talent, but no team in the Big 12 has great talent. They return Cam Rising. I believe it's really only his 3rd year starting just because he's had so many injuries, but he is a veteran leader, and this is a Utah team at home with that defense and also carrying that good defense on the road. I think they possibly can make the playoff. If they lose 2 games, do they make? I mean, they go 10-2. Maybe they go 11-2. They make the Big 12 championship. They lose it, but they've already got 11 wins. So they're slotted right there in front of Tennessee as the number 10 overall seed. Certainly, we could only have one Big 12 team making the playoff. That could definitely happen, but I do like the way Utah profiles, possibly not to win the Big 12, although they might also win the Big 12, but I think potentially 2 Big 12 teams can get in, even though it is a mosh pit. It depends. If they're able to finish 11-2, maybe lose the Big 12 championship, which would be this hypothetical scenario, obviously, considering they don't get the auto bye. That's just the way things work. And I'll also talk about the auto buys and how interesting that is, because a lot of people are going to be very disappointed with the auto buys. I'll just be honest, just because it really doesn't make sense when you've got some of these conferences and how loaded they are, but I do have Utah making it there. Moving on to the number 9 overall seed, it is Notre Dame. So this year, it seems like not obvious, but I definitely do believe Notre Dame will be making the playoff. I think they will be going 10-2, and I think if they do go 10-2, they will be slotted at number 9 for a number of reasons. You do have the idea that Notre Dame doesn't have to play in a conference championship, so you get that extra rest. It's very possible a 3-loss team can easily be slotted over them, especially if the 3-loss team loses their conference championship game, because Notre Dame doesn't have to compete in that. So I do think they're going to get dinged for that, but they're still going to make the playoff, you would think. They've got a very manageable schedule this year. They've still got a few tough games, but being the independent, they face all the ACC teams. Again, they've got a few tough games. Riley Leonard, there's some unknowns there. Huge week 1 game, seismic. If they lose their week 1 game on the road at A&M, it's going to be very hard for them to make the playoff, because I think at 9-3, there's no way they make it. And the reason is simply because they don't have that conference championship game. 9-3, with that schedule, it's going to be very tough. Sure, they're going to be a fringe team, but I do think they can finish 10-2. It's very important they get that week 1 win, and it's a very hard game. They're underdogs on the road at A&M, 2.5-point underdogs. Riley Leonard announced as the starting QB. I do think if Notre Dame loses that game, it's going to be very hard for them. But if they win it, they should have relatively smooth sailing with some potential leniency, even if they lose 2 games, because it is a 12-team playoff, to where they will make the playoff. Now, if you are Notre Dame, you cannot get a top 4 seed. You cannot get a bye because there's no conference championship with them, but you can get the number 5 seed. It'll be interesting. What if they finish 11-1? Would the committee really give them the number 5 seed to where they almost get like a bye, because they would be facing a team like Memphis? That's not to say Memphis is bad, or UTSA, whoever the team is, but if you get the number 5 seed, you're going to be facing that group of 5 auto bid we would expect. So we'll have to see what happens when it comes to Notre Dame, but they're in at the number 9 overall seed for me. Moving on to number 8, we do have Clemson. So Clemson out of the ACC. This would be them possibly losing the ACC championship, and I think Clemson is just being underrated. Clemson, I feel like the last 2 years they've been out of the playoff picture early, because remember, we're talking about a 4-team playoff, so if you lose 1 game early in the season, it's especially if you're in the ACC, it's extremely hard to come back from that. But Clemson's finished off the last 2 seasons really good, especially this last season. And I do think Clemson, they have a really talented defense. There's a lot of narrative about Dabo Swinney not taking players in the portal. Yes, that is a thing, but they've recruited defense amazingly. They've got a top 10 pure talent roster in college football. Cade Klubnik, the young 5-star, well, I mean, I guess he's not young anymore. This is his 3rd year, and that's part of the reason I'm picking Clemson, because he's got some experience now. Clemson at home, very hard to win there. I do think in an ACC that is still down, and with FSU, a lot of question marks surrounding them, Clemson can work their way, not even having to win the conference, maybe losing 2 games, maybe losing 1 game, although I do think it's most likely they go 11-2 and possibly make the playoff. Now, whether or not you want to say they'd be behind Notre Dame, in front of Notre Dame, I think for sure they'd be in front of Notre Dame if both Notre Dame and Clemson had 2 losses, because Clemson possibly would be in their conference championship, and that would be 1 loss. Even if if they go 10-3, I wonder if they possibly could make it with the conference championship loss. It's going to be hard, though, because the ACC is definitely not as talented as the Big Ten or the SEC. But you know what? I'm going with Clemson. A lot of people are kind of fading them. It seems like their dynasty at this point is clearly over, but that doesn't mean they can't make a 12-team playoff with the amount of talent that they had. It's going to be different this year. Moving on to the number 7 overall seed, it is going to be Penn State. So Penn State, it's about time they make a playoff. If you look at the previous history, like the last 5 or 6 years, they seem to always finish in the range of like 6-13. And so for this, it's perfect. I think they finally will make a playoff. Yes, it's expanded, but they are a very solid team. I think the last 3 years, they've had a top 5 defense. They're projected to have another top 5 defense. We'll see with their offense, but normally their offense is good enough, especially with the home field advantage. They've got a huge game hosting Ohio State middle of the season. I think that's probably a 3:30 game. I don't think it's their whiteout game, but Penn State, for them to get this rank, they probably would have to have 2 losses, so they'd be going 10-2, possibly losing to Ohio State and someone else and not making the Big Ten championship game. The likely scenario there would be Penn State with the 2 losses, maybe even 3 losses to where they could make it, although I don't think they'd be ranked this high. They'd probably be 10th or 11th in terms of of seeds. But I do think in this scenario, they would have 2 losses. Ohio State and Oregon would be the 2 teams going to the Big Ten championship game, and another big team in the Big Ten, Michigan, would be on the outside looking in. A lot of people are picking against both Michigan and Missouri, I'm seeing, and I am on that train. I do not think Michigan or Missouri will be making the playoff. Missouri does have a very easy schedule in the SEC, I agree, but when you've got a team like that with high expectations, they're not used to it, it's hard to manage. So I am going with Penn State to finally make a playoff. They just fit the profile very well in terms of that. Moving on to the number 6 overall seed, I'm going to go with Oregon. So I've seen Oregon projected as the number 1 overall seed, the number 2 overall seed, the number 5 overall seed. I am going with the number 6 overall seed. So now we get to the big dogs in the big time conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC. It's going to be Ohio State. It's going to be Oregon. It's very likely, in my opinion, going to be Alabama and Georgia. And so the 6th seed, it would be Oregon. This would be possibly Ohio State beating Oregon. Well, this could be a scenario where it's like Oregon beats Ohio State in the regular season, but then loses to another team, and then loses to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship. So they have 2 losses, but obviously, I mean, the FPI is going to love them. Their ratings already are great. The reason they'd be behind the number 5 seed, which could be Alabama, would just be based off of preference. Maybe Alabama's got a bigger win. Maybe they've got more impressive metrics, if that does work out like that. But there's going to be some interesting jockeying for the number 5 seed, because you want that. You would be hosting the group of 5 team, we would think. And Oregon, I do think they're a really good team, but I have them losing to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State has not won the Big Ten championship in over, 3 years now. I think they're overdue to win that. And that should be a really good game. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Oregon wins the Week 5 or Week 6 matchup at home, the 7:30 game, the primetime game against Ohio State. You could be looking at a 2v3 matchup, 1v2, just depends. But both of those teams should be undefeated. That's going to be a huge game early in the season. But I do think Oregon, this would be kind of a disappointment for a lot of Oregon fans. There's so much hype surrounding this team. Everyone thinks they're either going to be the number 1 seed, the number 2 seed, maybe the number 5 seed, but I've got them at number 6. Just behind some SEC teams. Moving on to number 5, it is Alabama. So I'm sure Alabama would be very happy with this. They would be hosting Memphis in this scenario. And look, there's a lot of... Originally, it seemed like everyone was like, Alabama's done, they're falling. But now people are starting to realize, yes, they lost Caleb Downs. They lost Proctor, the big offensive tackle. Then they got him back. Bama has money. Bama's got a ridiculously top 4 overall talented roster. Probably top 3 with Georgia and Ohio State. And they will be absolutely fine returning Jalen Milroe with experience now, the big quarterback, dual threat. He can throw, he can run, and they're going to have a ton of talent. They did lose a receiver to the transfer portal, but I do think Alabama will still be good even without Saban. There was that unknown period, but now Bama, you look at their schedule, I think it's manageable enough to where even if they lose 2 games, you could be talking about them getting the number 5 overall seed just based on how hard the SEC is, especially if they end up losing their conference championship to Georgia. Do you really punish that too bad? You really can't. So they would be the number 5 seed, and they would be getting Memphis, the group of 5 team, in this scenario in round 1. Moving on to the auto buys, number 4 first. So these are all the conference championship winners out of the Big 4 conferences, the Power 4. It is going to be Kansas out of the Big 12. So I really do like Kansas this year. This is kind of a leap of faith, if you will. I'm just a fan of teams that have really explosive offenses. I think you could argue Kansas has the most talented offense in the entire Big 12. Now, yes, there are injury concerns with Daniels, the QB. He's been hurt the past 2 years, but if he's healthy, you've got Devin Neal, the star running back, who was really good last year. Kansas, the situation with them not playing at their home stadium, playing at Arrowhead, it's going to be hard. There's no doubt about that. But I do think Kansas, this could be the year. And really, this is just flip a coin. You could have Utah here. You could have Oklahoma State here. You could have Kansas State here as well. There are just so many teams in the Big 12 that potentially could make or not only make the playoff, but win the conference, which would jolt them to being the number 4 overall seed. And you kind of see the issue with the whole thing where the Big 12 gets an auto bye in the first round, Kansas being over Oregon and Alabama. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just how it is right now. That's the format. I wonder what happens when we expand to 14 teams, but I do like Kansas and their offense possibly to make the playoff and maybe even get that first round bye. That would be amazing. It would be honestly good for college football if it happened, but people would be pissed. There's no doubt about it. Moving on to the number 3 overall seed, it is going to be Miami. So I am not alone on this. There are a lot of people picking Miami. I look at the trends with a lot of these really good quarterbacks transferring from smaller schools to better schools, and it's really good. And I think Cam Ward's going to be the next one. I don't know if Cam Ward will win the Heisman, but I think he's going to be top 3 for Heisman. And this is a Miami team that has loaded up. They've spent a bunch of money, and it's another kind of leap of faith for sure. I mean, you could say, well, FSU, maybe a Clemson, maybe someone else in the ACC possibly could make it. You've got Virginia Tech right there as well, maybe as an underdog, dark horse. But Miami, it's really just, is it their year? I mean, remember, back in like 2017, I think Miami was the number 2 overall team in the country going into the final weekend of the regular season and then lost to Pitt. So it's not like Miami, it's not impossible for them to start the season 10-0, 11-0. They've got a manageable enough schedule. That week 1 game is going to be tough. I mean, if they can just eke out that week 1 game, it's a rivalry game. Miami at Florida in the Swamp. Florida's got the very hard schedule. So for Miami, that's kind of a lose-lose game when you think about it. It's a very hard week 1 game. The Swamp is going to be, extremely loud. And on top of that, Florida has the toughest schedule in college football. So it's not like this is going to be a quality win for you. So if you beat Florida's probably going to finish the season 6-6. So it's just get out of there with a win, get out of there perfectly fine, and then win the ACC. I mean, they could lose 2 games, win the ACC. They're going to get an auto bye. So that's really what's important, winning the ACC for Miami, and we will see if they're able to do it, but they are my number 3 overall seed. And then my top 2, it is kind of boring. At number 2, it is going to be Ohio State. So obviously with Ohio State, kind of a very similar situation as Oregon. They're either going to be a top 2 seed or probably number 5 or number 6. They are ridiculously talented. I do think they are the most talented roster in college football when you account for the transfer portal additions. They do have a little bit of a question mark when it comes to the offensive line. You could also say the quarterback, Will Howard, is he good enough from Kansas State? I do think he is an upgrade over Kyle McCord. I do not believe that people just don't realize Kyle McCord's a very mediocre quarterback. They think like him and Howard are on the same level. I think Will Howard's significantly better than Kyle McCord, and I think that'll be shown this year. Ohio State still has unbelievable receivers. I mean, every position they're loaded. The defense, they returned basically everyone. So this is a juggernaut team, and the only question is, will they be a top 2 team and get that first round bye, or will they be ranked 5th or 6th if they lose to Oregon in the Big Ten Championship? There are some interesting regular season games for Ohio State as well. I mean, they're at Oregon and at Penn State. Those are losable games. They are. Now, I don't think Ohio State will lose both of those games. They'll probably lose one of them, and they'll probably go into the Big Ten Championship game with 1 loss. But it is realistic where Ohio State, they could go 10-2, and if they lose to Penn State and Oregon, based off of tiebreakers, they might both be in the Big Ten Championship. That would be a nightmare scenario for the Buckeyes. It is possible, though, because both of those are road games. But we will see. Either way, I do have Ohio State absurdly easy non-conference, ridiculously easy to start the season. There's no doubt about that. I have them as the number 2 seed. And then moving on to the number 1 overall seed, very boring. It is going to be Georgia. So I did contemplate possibly putting in Alabama here, but I just can't do it. Georgia, they are the best team in college football right now based off of returning talent, especially at the quarterback position. Carson Beck possibly going to be a top 5, maybe even the number 1 overall pick. Really good pure passer. Showed a ton last year. Georgia, we all knew they were like a top 2, maybe even the best team in college football last year, but just with the 4-team playoff, losing that close game to Alabama, and then just destroying FSU in, the Orange Bowl or whatever it is. I think Georgia will be the number 1 overall seed. They always have a ridiculous defense. The talent they have, the depth is what it is with Georgia on defense. They have so many bodies that are just elite football players. And the fundamentals with Georgia, I mean, even though, listen, they have problems off the field, there's no doubt about it. I mean, at some point, they're going to have to get that under control. But when it comes to on-field performance, it's funny, will the off-the-field stuff catch up to them on the field? It hasn't yet, and it's hard to say it will. So I think even in a worst-case scenario, Georgia will be making the playoff. Maybe they end up losing the SEC championship, but they still will likely make it anyways. Either way, guys, those are just my predictions for the 12-team college football playoff, the first year we're seeing this. That's going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.